Living in New York was painful for me. It's clean, and it's clean. New York, I was having to pay city tax, I was paying state tax, I was paying federal tax.
Would you retire in Singapore?
This is Howard. He works for a multinational corporation.
I work in finance, in banking.
And he's been living in Singapore for 2 years. But he moved here not from London, as you might think, but from New York. He used to live in many countries.
I was born in the UK, in Australia, Japan, and the US.
I asked Howard some tricky questions, and he explained what you should watch out before moving to Singapore, especially from Europe and America. Enjoy.
Can you name 3 biggest differences of living in New York versus Singapore?
It's clean, and it's clean. New York is vibrant, massive metropolis, very, very international. But it's freezing in the winter, and it's relatively dirty without being too disrespectful to New York. Singapore you can feel how safe and clean it is, but that's kind of a known entity when you come into Singapore. Yeah. The weather, I think, is probably the other biggest difference. New York has brutally hot summers, freezing cold winters, and I think that on a daily basis I kind of thank Singapore for not being the same as that. It's just brutally hot all the time here.
Did you actually feel like unsafe being in New York? Or it's more like you kind of feel it but you're not experienced it?
You feel it on occasion. I think New York is very segmented. So we lived in an area that was moderately safe, but there's no part of New York that's completely safe. So we were lucky enough to be in Midtown Manhattan, which meant that, yeah, it's not the same as some other parts of New York, but you don't have to go far to get into places, or even times a day. The financial district is a beautiful part of New York, but it's still, you need to have your wits about you, I think, and you wouldn't do certain things that you do here in Singapore commonly, like chopping tables, which is a habit that I now do, of just like leaving a card or your phone or your wallet around the place. To reserve a table. Yeah. That's a habit that I now do, but you wouldn't even think about that, I think, anywhere in the US or Europe, or probably outside of Singapore, to be honest. Good thing about Singapore is that you don't have to look far to find the prices of things. If I gave you my address, you can look up what the rent was 5 years ago, what it is today, and as soon as the rent gets hiked at the end of the year, you can probably look up what it's going to be there as well. So that information is accurate and freely available. I think what's really interesting about renting here is you can trust in the information that is on websites and on apps. So I only found out recently that the space that is listed on advertisements, it's often not a round number. So a 1,500 square foot apartment will be listed as 1,521, for example. Yeah. I didn't realize that's because it's government mandated. When a building goes up, it is literally inspected by the authorities, they find out what the size is, and if you're ever caught not listing that size, you get into trouble. As a renter or as a buyer, you can trust the fact that what you're buying is what's reflected on those advertisements.
Can you compare, like, in general life in the US and in Singapore?
I've loved bikes my whole life. Living in New York was painful for me because I could never really own a bike, truly. Too cold in the winter, it was too unsafe. Theft of bikes was, you leave it on the street, it'll be gone, almost guaranteed. I did miss riding, and I think that Singapore is a beautiful place to own a bike. It's expensive, and we can all complain about the cost of COEs, but it's definitely easy to enjoy. My commute on a motorcycle is hugely satisfying. I love being able to ride around Singapore. And without harping on the safety aspect of things, but having kids, it just makes my whole life easier here in Singapore. New York was a struggle in that regard. Yeah. Like I said, we loved our time there, and we miss it a lot, but there's an element of ease that comes with life in Singapore.
Can you compare, for example, schools or kindergartens in the US or in New York and Singapore?
We were quite lucky. We live very close to the school that my children went to. It was a very good school, but that was mainly luck. I mean, we were fortunate enough that they opened a school near us just as my kids were coming to the age where they needed to go to school. We learned very quickly that there's complex feeder systems there, like going into one school to get into the next, to get into college, etc., etc. The public schools are very, very good, and people will move house just to get close to a place that they can put their child into school, which we really didn't plan for or appreciate when we first started looking at where we should live. Singapore is, I mean, it's straightforward. It's crazy expensive, but for private education or international schools for children, yeah. But it's very straightforward. There seems to be spaces when you need them, and there's plenty of choice. So it's a question of just picking one and biting the bullet.
Are there any hidden things that people should know before considering to move here?
I think there's a little bit of fear-mongering from an outsider's perspective to Singapore on rule following and how strict Singapore is. It's only true to an extent. Singapore has rules, they are strongly enforced. I mean, not any more strongly enforced than other places I could give examples of. I think the thing that was new to me, or that I realized quite quickly, is that things work here. The government functions very, very well. And it's more reasonable than you might expect. So applications for visas are very, very straightforward. They're efficient, they work. It doesn't mean you'll always get them, but you'll know the answer. Most government bureaucrats that I've interacted with are actually very, very reasonable. And if things don't make sense, they get changed. It does have to then be documented and written down and recorded, but things function. And I don't think that that's necessarily something I appreciated fully before moving here.
Hey guys, one important thing. We put so much effort into making these videos 2 times a week. I have a team of 4 people, including me. I would really appreciate if you can just like this video, press the subscribe button. It will help us a lot. Because for now, I'm investing so much money and effort and energy into this project. And we are not profitable yet. So your support, if you subscribe to this channel, would help us a lot. Thank you very much.
How long have you been staying in this condo?
Since we got here, 2 years. We did a few months in a service department. Yeah, it'll be a shame to move, but the whole rent price craziness has kicked in big time, but that's okay. Chance to explore a new area.
Where are you moving to? Which area?
Bukit Timah?
Bukit Timah. Oh, nice, man. For riding is great, yeah. The area nearby.
Yeah, I think so. I'm still exploring it. In terms of cost of living, yes, it can be high. I've heard, when I first moved here, I've heard people refer to vice taxes, the idea that if you want to do things that you don't need to, if you want to drink, if you want to drive a car, all those sort of things you can do, but they're going to come at a cost. And you pay for that with massive taxation on alcohol, massive COEs on vehicles, that sort of stuff. So yes, it can get quite expensive, but it doesn't have to be. There are very, very cheap places to eat. There are fun things to do with the kids that are essentially free. There's good public parks here. But yeah, there are plenty of other things that you can waste your money on.
If you go to a nice restaurant, let's say with your wife, how much would you spend for dinner?
If it's a nice restaurant and you're talking Sing dollars, it's going to be $20, $30 a dish. It depends. Again, it goes back to that whole
Plus.
Yeah, plus. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone getting stung. Like, you don't turn up at a place thinking it's going to be cheap and it turns out to be expensive. Yeah. You know what you're getting into. If you want to go somewhere expensive, there's 1,000 places with 1 million reviews each. You'll know what you're going to get. And vice versa, if you want something cheap and cheerful, that's actually much more available than I thought it was going to be, and everywhere in between. The plus is interesting because you should know before you get in there if it's going to include the tax and the service charge. That's a big difference from the US. Yeah, and that's something I don't miss from the US is the fact that most wait staff are paid on tips and therefore they earn below minimum wage. So you're kind of expected to give 20% even if the service is questionable, which takes away the idea of it being a tip. But look, it's ingrained societally there, so you just have to go along with it. That doesn't exist here, but there are definitely add-on service tips in some restaurants.
I was always thinking, if you tip in a restaurant, would they give it to you back or they just keep it?
I don't know. I haven't experienced that here in Singapore. I have been chased out of a restaurant in Japan when I first got there and left a tip, and they thought it was a mistake, so they followed me out, because you just don't do that in Japan at all, which I sort of knew, but I was in the habit of doing it anyway, and it was, yeah. But in there, they will follow you out and give it back. Yeah.
You live in so many countries. Which country is the easiest for you as British to be in, to live in? And which country is more difficult?
Japan was the biggest shock to the system. Yeah. Japan is culturally a very insular nation, and almost proudly so. And that's not to say they're not unwelcoming. We felt very welcome. We had a lot of friends there. My kids were born there. It's a beautiful country, but it's not set up for foreigners to come in and work. So we were very fortunate to have spent some time there. On the other end of the scale, Singapore is almost designed to allow for foreigners to come in and out. So in terms of how quick it was for me to, say, get my driving license here or get the visa done, the process done for the visa once we arrived was shockingly easy, whereas other places just didn't really have that. Singapore almost has an enforced level of integration, like the idea of having different nationalities or different people, different cultures forcibly separated is very, very closely monitored. I know the HDB formalities ensure that different cultures live and work together, which was a strange thing that I didn't really understand until I got here. You don't see that, or at least I didn't see that in other places like the US or Australia.
If you compare the salaries, let's say in Singapore, New York, London and Sydney, what would be the difference? What would be the highest, what would be the lowest?
They're comparable. They're pretty freely available. Glassdoor and LinkedIn and all these sort of things will tell you the actual numbers, but the biggest difference with Singapore and the known biggest selling point for Singapore is the tax. So New York, I was having to pay city tax, I was paying state tax, I was paying federal tax, and everything else in between. Singapore is much, much simpler, much lower, and much more easy to understand. It's straightforward. If you're paid X in London, you're going to be paid X in Singapore, but you're going to have a massive tax break.
What things you miss the most from Britain or from the US?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's certainly not food from Britain. I miss sport in Australia. The Australian love of any sport, every single activity was fantastic. Like you could follow football, soccer, you could follow rugby. I even had Australian friends who were keenly following American football, which was a surprise to me when I got there. Yeah. And I always sort of grew up with the idea of you follow one sport, or maybe two. You follow one for the winter and one for the summer. And the idea that, no, you can just follow any and all sport was something I was exposed to in Australia. I missed that because I realized after we left that that is quite an Australian mentality, which we enjoyed. But I think there's probably little bits of things that we've picked up from different places we've lived in.
Is Singlish something like difficult or confusing for Englishmen? I heard from some people, like native speakers, that when they hear Singlish and list simplification of like sentences, they're like, oh shit, you don't do it.
I'd heard it before, enough of it. I think until I got here, I didn't appreciate just how much Singlish there is. Everyone's heard of can and cannot, but there is way, way, way more to it. And if you really want to understand what's going on, I think you do have to at least make an effort. None of it's unintelligible. I think there are certain words that are completely new. So just recently I learned atas, which is the idea of somewhere being kind of fancier. I went for a coffee and someone said it was a very atas place versus going just for kopi. Yeah. So certain words like that I enjoy picking up, or at least learning a little bit about. But I think more than that, there's an element of just abbreviating everything, skimming sentences down to the bare minimum. I think the thing that I find hardest to get though is using initials for things. So using three-letter initializations rather than just saying the whole thing. Yeah. At work, at least, that can cause some confusion and slow things down rather than speeding things up, especially if you're talking to me, because I end up having to get reminded of what that means or what that means.
Singaporean would never say like Johor Bahru. They would say JB.
Exactly. It's sort of synonymous with the UK versus United Kingdom. I get that, that's okay, but it just is way, way longer. The list is far, far longer. Yeah. But yeah, that's just an acclimatization, I think, getting used to it.
Is it any things that still like amuse you in Singapore? You're kind of not used to it?
It's always going to be a small place to live. Yeah. I've spoken about this with friends and family back home, about how everyone knows it as a city-state, so it's obviously a very small place to live, but at the same time it's still a big city if you compare it to other cities. So there's still a lot to do and to see, but you realize very quickly how fast you can run out of places to go.
What's the three things that you don't like about Singapore?
People don't seem to signal. They don't use indicators anywhere near as much as you would expect. Riding defensively is something people should always do whenever on a motorbike, but sort of doubly so if you're expecting someone to turn or not to turn, just assume they are about to turn. Yeah. That seems to be a common habit here in Singapore.
Would you retire in Singapore? Or like when your kids grow up, you probably go somewhere?
I think that depends. Actually, it almost leads on to the other piece, which I hadn't fully understood until I got here, of the tiering and types of people who live here. So you can be a citizen, a full Singaporean citizen, which you can become later in life. You can be on PR, which is permanent residency and allows us to stay long term. Or there's a whole raft of different visas that you can get. If you're on this raft of different visas, then obviously retiring in Singapore is probably not something you should think about. But if you take the path through PR and into citizenship, then yeah, you could certainly retire here.
If paperwork is sorted, would you stay here forever?
I could see myself, but I don't want to tell my mum that. It's a ways off, we'll see.
Yeah. Cool, thanks a lot, man.
Done?
Thank you.